Welcome everyone to this session of the DEMOS21 lecture series on contemporary European democratic theory. It's a great pleasure and honor that we have with us today Jamila Mascat from the University of Utrecht, where she is an assistant professor in Gender and Postcolonial Studies at the Department of Media and Cultural Studies. Today she will talk on the topic of post-colonial justice, and the paper is entitled Towards a Theory of Post-Colonial Justice. That's also very much the center of her contemporary research, which focuses on issues of post-colonialism, Hegelianism, Marxism, and feminist theories, and she's author of many books, some of which are in Italian, such as Hegel a Jena, La critica, dell'astrazione, 2011, and also editor of many volumes on Hegel, also on the reception of Hegel in France. So she's been working with Jean-François G.W.F at Paris for many years and has been affiliated with that group that carries out research in legal philosophy, practical philosophy, political philosophy, which is a very productive and stimulating research group. So we're very happy that you're here today and that we're able to discuss the paper with you. It's this hybrid setting, so we have a few people here in the room and then a few people joining online. If you have a question, raise your hand either physically or virtually by using the corresponding button, and I'm sure you all know by now how that works. So without further ado, Jamila, the floor is yours, and I look forward to your talk and the following discussion.
Yes, so yeah, good evening, everybody, and thanks, Julian, for inviting me, and thanks to you for being there tonight and discussing this paper with me. I just would like to say so that this paper is, of course, a very provisional outcome of a research currently underway, which is far from being accomplished. And it's a pandemic research, I would say. So I started to be interested in the topic of post-colonial justice and post-colonial reparations during the pandemic. And I've been independently from the pandemic, but during the pandemic. And I would say that like the two main goals of this research are one probably more practically oriented and the other one more theoretical. The practically oriented one is the fact that I do believe that theory can provide strength, consistency, and legitimacy to the many claims for reparation, to many demands of reparation that are becoming more and more visible and more audible in the global public sphere. The more theoretical, or maybe the purely theoretical reason is an engagement, a specific engagement in the field of post-colonial studies. Post-colonial studies haven't explored so far the notion of post-colonial justice. And in many ways, I believe that the theory of post-colonial justice may be the sort of parse constructs of post-colonial critique considered as the negative, like the parse destruents with which post-colonial studies are very often associated for good reason as well. I have a quote just to give you an idea of the way in which this negative, this critical and negative dimension of post-colonial critique is usually accused of being or blamed for being a sort of theoretical exercise in mourning. And that was a friend of mine who just sent me, so the book cover of an upcoming book of Italian philosopher Maurizio Ferraris, who's actually very often invited at Paris Panthéon-Sorbonne. The book is entitled Post-Colonial Studies, so colonial like corona. And the cover, so on the cover of the book, it is written, unlike post-colonial studies that only indulge in mourning, post-colonial studies think about the future and commit to the task of changing the present. So to some extent, I would like my research to be a small contribution to the task of rescuing post-colonial studies from this very recurrent and unfair accusation of being as I said, like a theory for mourning the past, mourning the present. And I do believe that postcolonial studies or postcolonial theory has something to offer in terms of thinking the future and thinking how to change the present. So that said, maybe just a very brief preliminary coming out about a limit, or maybe there are more limits, but at least one limit that I clearly see, and something that I definitely should improve. I'm not happy about it, is that at this stage, I think it's not really visible the way I do mobilize post-colonial sources and resources in my research. So one could ask, for example, where is Fanon, where is Said, where is Césaire, where is Mohanty, just to name a few authors, or more generally, what is the space that their works occupy in a theory of post-colonial justice? And I do believe that they do occupy a very relevant space, but it's really implicit at this stage. I guess it's really mostly on my head, in my theoretical background, but it needs to be developed and articulated much more explicitly. That's like the coming out about the limits of this research, at least one of them. And for today, so in my paper, I'll start by providing a definition of postcolonial justice, what are its objects and objectives, as well as where postcolonial justice stands in relation to transitional justice, distributive justice, corrective justice, global justice on the one hand, and on the other hand, what is specific relation of postcolonial justice, theory of postcolonial justice, with critique of capitalism, imperialism, and neocolonialism. And then I will look at reparation claims as the core of a theory of postcolonial justice. I will not be able to map exhaustively the debate on reparation, which is a huge debate, but I will just retrace a very short genealogy on the international debate starting from Durban 2001, the United Nations International World Conference Against Racism. And so I'll just look at this very short segment of history from 2001 to 2021, and I will attempt at summarizing some of the recurring legal and political objections to reparation and some of the best counter-arguments developed against these objections. And I will conclude by arguing to what extent postcolonial justice is both critical and reparative, and is, I would say, critical insofar as it is reparative, and it is reparative insofar as it is critical. But I will get back to that in a second. So what does it mean to do justice in a post-colonial world? This is, I guess, the main concern of my research and of the paper today. But then what is the post-colonial indeed? And I choose to provide two very suggestive definitions of the post-colonial condition. The first one is Gerard Spivak's characterization of the post-colonial as the child of a rape. And then the second one is a sentence that it's quoted by Françoise Vergès in the incipit of an article on colonizing citizenship. And the quote is by a quote from Huguette Belot, a former representative of Reunion Island at the French National Assembly. And the quote goes as follows: "We are not the victims, but the children of a crime against humanity." So on the one hand, post-colonialism or the post-colonial condition as the child of a rape. On the other hand, the post-colonial subject being not the victims, but the children of a crime against humanity. So in both cases, strong emphasis is placed on the filiation of the post-colonial condition from colonialism to highlight that the post in the post-colonial, there's been a huge debate about the very meaning of this post in the post-colonial. But I would say that emphasis on filiation clearly highlights that the post-colonial is not meant to turn the page and to move on with regards to the colonial condition. And for the post-colonial child, as Spivak would say, it is impossible to purely repudiate the colonial violation from which it originates. And that violation must be conceived as an enabling violation, to quote from Spivak again. And from this specific understanding of the post-colonial in Spivak originate a plea for critique. Critique, conceived as the construction, is for Spivak the main Stimmung of the post-colonial, whose aim is precisely persistently critique a structure that one cannot not inhabit, or, quoting again from Spivak, a structure that one cannot not wish to inhabit, the post-colonial condition itself. In many ways, the post-colonial condition is a point of no return, something that cannot be praised for sure, but something that cannot be entirely repudiated, precisely because it produced children, according to this metaphor that Spivak uses. So if the post-colonial is this point of no return, the aim of post-colonial justice consists in doing justice to the irreparable. That's, again, borrowing from Magali Besson, whose 2019 book on reparation was entitled Faire justice de l'irréparable, so doing justice to the irreparable, namely those historical crimes such as colonization, transatlantic slavery, and the genocide of indigenous peoples that constitute the darker side of Western modernity, as suggested by Walter Mignolo. Since both are committed to the task of remedying gross violations of human rights, clearly a rapprochement may be established between post-colonial and transitional justice. And as you know, transitional justice intervenes in post-war, post-dictatorial, post-genocidal contexts to recover the victims from the harm that they suffered, to reconcile society, and allow for the restoration of peace or democracy. And the four pillars of transitional justice, so one, the prosecution of the perpetrators, two, truth-seeking, three, reparations of all sorts, material reparations, symbolic reparations, individual, collective, and number four, reforms as guarantees of non-recurrence. These four pillars that aim at recognizing the dignity of the victims, acknowledging the violations that happen, and preventing future abuses, of course, may resonate quite clearly, quite intuitively with a notion or a concept of post-colonial justice. So I would maintain that transitional justice is very similar to post-colonial justice, or at least appears very similar to post-colonial justice in its principle and in its goals. But post-colonial justice engages with mass crimes of a different scale, of a higher scale. So crimes that have been perpetrated on millions of human beings across the world. And those mass crimes are also remote, more or less remote historical crimes. Those victims may be long dead, and the perpetrators also may be not traceable anymore. And those differences in scale and remoteness, so to say, of the crimes are crucial to the arguments that are often mobilized for dismissing the legitimacy of claims for slavery and colonial reparations. I can go back to that in the discussion if you want to clarify what are the recurring and constant arguments that are brought in the discussion for dismissing claims for reparations, especially claims for slavery and colonial reparations. Now, the corrective approach, which is part of transitional justice that correspond to the first principle, so the prosecution of the perpetrators, is rejected by many advocates of reparations, while I do believe, and I will say in a minute why, that it still can be considered as a crucial component of the theory of postcolonial justice. The rejection of this corrective dimension of transitional justice by advocates of reparation is premised on two main arguments. So on the one hand, the assumption that it is impossible to obtain restitution and accountability when it comes to remote mass violations, such as, once again, slavery and colonial crimes. And number two, on the claim that the focus of reparative justice, so the focus of post-colonial justice, qua reparative justice, should be remedying the damages suffered by the victims rather than inflicting punishments to the perpetrators. So basically, reparative justice and post-colonial justice, qua reparative justice, should focus on how to repair the victims, how to remedy the damages rather than in punishing the wrongs. I believe instead that post-colonial justice could actually partially recur to the corrective approach for prosecuting institutional agents, such as, for example, firms, banks, and insurance companies that have been historically involved in transatlantic slave trade and colonial crimes and have largely benefit from them. And this, of course, it's already happened. This is not something that I'm suggesting in abstract. This is something that has been concretely happening. Now, besides the prosecution of the perpetrators, reparation has the normative core of transitional justice, of course, also play a crucial role in the theory of postcolonial justice, as much as truth-telling, and institutional reforms. So again, we can find, I guess, the possibility of conceiving of the four pillars of transitional justice as being part of a theory of postcolonial justice. So I would maintain that transitional justice and postcolonial justice have a lot in common. Postcolonial justice, though, can be considered much less optimistic than transitional justice, since transitional justice result in reconciliation, while postcolonial justice, I guess, may only result in the possibility of reestablishing the social contract on slightly fairer grounds. Although this is an open discussion in the sense that many advocates for reparation do believe in the reconciliatory power of reparation. And for example, Catherine Slu's book on justice and reconciliation in word politics is precisely about the possibility of thinking reconciliation through reparation. I'm a bit more skeptical about it. For what concerns the role that postcolonial justice occupies in relation to distributive justice, well, it can be stated that two paradigms have different orientation. Distributive justice engages with the task of redressing current inequalities, qua injustices, through fair redistribution of resources and costs, while postcolonial justice only focuses on past injustices. Nevertheless, one can see the complementarity of these two paradigms, and one can argue that postcolonial justice includes claims and measures that could possibly contribute to the implementation of distributive goals, and that in turn, distributive justice may support demands for reparations, relying on the moral obligation and the moral responsibilities that all citizens share to assist fellow citizens who have been victims of historical injustice to obtain remedy and reparation for these wrongs of the past. But a major concern, I would say, for a theory of postcolonial justice is to understand or to what extent postcolonial justice can be achieved in our current world, to what extent postcolonial justice can be achieved in a neoliberal world order. Can postcolonial justice do without envisioning the elimination of all geopolitical imbalances between the global north and the global south, without the dismantle of neocolonial international relations? Or can, in other words, a theory of postcolonial justice be limited to doing justice to the past, so only to the past? And paradoxically, I'll argue that, yes, in principle, it is possible. And in my view, actually, postcolonial justice is actually nothing but a subchapter of a broader theory of global justice, qua anti-capitalist justice, and in no way an alternative to it. So postcolonial justice has a quite limited scope, and its scope is concerned with focusing on remedy to past injustices. But of course, this doesn't mean that postcolonial justice can replace the need for a theory of global justice, which I understand as global anti-capitalist justice. My notion of global anti-capitalist justice is concerned with rights and obligation from a radically egalitarian perspective that guarantees and renders to each and everybody their due in turn being conceived through the prism of the famous principle that Marx exposed in his critique of the Gotha program, from each according to his ability and to each according to his needs. I mean, the pronouns should be changed, let's say, from each according to their ability and to each according to their needs. So global anti-capitalist justice is committed to redressing exploitation, violence, marginalization, cultural imperialism, and powerlessness, namely what Iris Marion has named as the 5 faces of oppression that are still responsible for the injustices inflicted upon the vast majority of the world population. Being a subchapter of a theory of global justice, postcolonial justice only focuses on past wrongs and past harms. And as such, as I said, its limited goal of doing justice to the past can be achieved even in an unjust present, while possibly contributing to make our unjust present maybe less unjust. So reparation of past crimes can be provided even if the present state of injustice. Disconnecting postcolonial justice from the major aims of a theory of global justice and critique of capitalism, namely, so a critique of global capitalism, imperialism, and neocolonialism, is an artificial exercise, and I nevertheless decided to embark on this abstract and artificial exercise and to conceive of postcolonial justice as a peculiar approach to justice that engages ex post with historical crimes and aims to repair only past injustices. I do share the idea of many scholars who advocate for reparation, that reparation should be paid to repair the present, or rather that to remedy the past is a way to remedy the present. So remedy the past for repairing the persisting consequences of the past into the present. But I do believe that postcolonial justice in its limited scope is essentially concerned with the past, with repairing history, repairing the legacy of history. So it is primarily backward looking, although its goals are forward looking. And this is a matter of debate among reparation scholars, to what extent indeed reparations are backward looking. I do believe that reparations are backward looking. On the other hand, the challenge of repairing the present would imply major structural changes aimed at confronting the injustice and inequalities that are produced by contemporary global capitalism. Postcolonial justice is therefore partial, so it is necessary but insufficient for achieving global justice. Insofar as doing justice to the past, of course, is not enough to do justice to the present. But despite the relative independence of postcolonial justice from all-encompassing programs and plans for global justice, the theory of postcolonial justice is a fundamental component of global justice, in as much as it sustains and supplements its critique of the inherent unfairness of capitalism. So postcolonial justice, as subchapter of a theory of global justice, indeed plays a role in supporting claims for global anti-capitalist justice. And it's quite a crucial component of an all-encompassing theory of global justice. Why? Well, first, I would say because by connecting the history of modern capitalism to slavery and colonialism, postcolonial justice show that there is more at stake with capitalism than mere unjust exploitation of workers by capital. Capitalism, in other words, has always been more than an exploitative mode of production. And through its colonial hands, it has proved to be a mode of intensive dehumanization. So the theory of postcolonial justice provides support to the thesis that the root of capitalism can be traced back to early modern colonialism and transatlantic slavery, to be considered as the primary source of primitive accumulation, or what has been named racial colonial primitive accumulation. If a theory of global justice needs to be sustained by a consistent critique of global capitalism, giving account of the massive injustice that the current economic system has caused and is still causing across the world, then the theory of postcolonial justice turned out to be crucially instrumental to strengthen such a critical endeavor. And this is why I would argue that a theory of global justice cannot but embrace simultaneously post-colonial justice and anti-capitalist justice lenses. On the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, postcolonial justice primarily engages with the task of doing justice to the past, and in that extent it's limited. But on the other hand, by revisiting history and historical injustices, a theory of postcolonial justice shows that the origin of capitalism and the flourishing of European modern societies cannot be separated from the long-lasting development of modern slavery and colonialism. So by doing justice to history, a theory of postcolonial justice introduces actually a radical counter-narrative of modernity, where mass capture and murder of human beings, drain of labor power, spoliation of resources, and intense extractivism, instrumental inclusion of the colonies into the capitalist world trade system at the benefit of metropolitan powers, cultural destruction and subjugation, deprivation of freedom, self-determination and sovereignty, imposition of foreign legislation and artificial national boundaries. All these interventions, and I think that was not an exhaustive list, can on no account be interpreted as contribution to the civilization of those being on the receiving end, and can only be acknowledged as the shameful sources of long-lasting historical damages. So to summarize this first attempt to provide a conceptual definition of postcolonial justice, I would say that postcolonial justice shares many features of transitional justice, although it projects them onto a different historical geographical scale. And I would maintain that postcolonial justice also encompasses the corrective paradigm, which is implicit or included in transitional justice paradigms when it comes to prosecuting institutional perpetrators of past crimes. Secondly, I would say that postcolonial justice is consistent with a framework of distributive justice, and distributive justice in turn may provide arguments for supporting demands for postcolonial justice. And thirdly, I would say that postcolonial justice is a key component of a radical egalitarian theory of global justice and a crucial ingredient of any critique of the capitalist world order. Now I would move to the core. So what is to be repaired? What's to be done and what's to be repaired? Because if postcolonial justice is to be understood as essentially reparative and remedial, of course, reparations are the main concern of a theory of postcolonial justice. And a theory of postcolonial justice then is meant to justify an account for reparation claims. Reparation claims share common moral grounds, but indeed claims for reparation for slavery, for colonial crimes, and for the genocide of indigenous peoples are always situated and site-specific. So on the one hand, they engage with history from different geographical locations, and on the other hand, they advocate for different reparative measures to be implemented. In my current research, I'm not engaging specifically with any of them. I'm focusing on what I call post-colonial reparations. So basically demands for reparation that have been raised by contemporary post-colonial citizenship in Western European countries, and some of those countries, of course, also include overseas territories, but is a research that focuses mostly on post-colonial Europe, or at least on the sort of backbone of post-colonial Europe, which include 8 countries, so Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and the UK. And I speak of post-colonial citizenship as based not on specific identities or nationalities, but as something that coming into being through activism and claimed for different kind of rights. So the post-colonial claim for post-colonial reparations can be connected to relatively recent claims that have been circulating transnationally in the European public sphere and advocate for reparation of injustices of the past that, of course, still result in present injustice. So I'm referring to claims you may be familiar with. Of course, there are also claims for slavery reparations, like the legal cases that have been brought before French courts by the MIR, the Mouvement International pour les Reparations, in Guadeloupe and in Martinique. But there are also claims for decolonizing the city or decolonizing public space, decolonizing the university, decolonizing education, decolonizing the humanities, the museum. So all these decolonial claims can also be considered as part of a theory of postcolonial justice and can be framed as demands for reparations. Those claims are raised in different national contexts, and they intervene in different public debates, and they are also mobilized by local actors. So of course, even if they share a common grammar, the claims can really take very different shapes in relation to the concrete contents of what is claimed in this demand. Now, to just provide you with a very short overview of the history of the last 20 years on reparation. The UN World Conference Against Racism that was held in Durban in 2001 can be considered really a milestone in the whole long history of reparations. And this year was indeed like the 20th anniversary of the Durban Conference. 2 major achievements can be mentioned in the final declaration that came out from this conference, Declaration and Program of Action, DTPA. The first one is the acknowledgement that slavery and colonialism are sources and causes of racism and racial discrimination. This is not banal in the sense that one can fight racism without necessarily connecting or one can oppose racism without necessarily connecting racism to past crimes. So the fact of establishing a connection between colonialism and transatlantic slavery and racism, contemporary racism and xenophobia, and defining colonialism, slavery as source and causes of current racism was actually a very relevant achievement, or anyway, something not so usual in the context of the international civil society debate on racism. But also the maybe most relevant aspect for the debate on reparation that came out from Durban 2001 was the call to provide, I quote, effective remedies, recourse, redress, and compensatory and other measures at the national, regional, and international levels. So there's a call for reparation that is included in the declaration. And there are, of course, several other aspects that actually encourage state to formulate explicit apologies. And there's a clear call to, again, provide remedy, provide reparation of any kind to those crimes of the past recognized as crimes and as causes of current racism and xenophobia. I mean, sadly, the debate on reparation did not raise unanimous enthusiasm at Durban, and this is the reason why 8 years after Geneva in 2009, the Durban Review Conference was actually highlighting to what extent the many challenges and obstacles identified in the Durban Declaration and Program of Action remain to be addressed and overcome. And lastly, I mean, in September 2021 was the 20th anniversary of Durban. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, has stressed emphasis on the relevance of reparative intervention and urged countries to confront with the legacy of slavery and colonialism, and with the explicit aim to make amends for these crimes. So that was, again, a sort of reminder of the importance of Durban 2001, 20 years after, that on the one hand show to what extent reparation have not been taken seriously, but by the states, but on the other hand, show the relevance that reparations are taking on a global public sphere level. This is why, I mean, a lot of scholars for reparation actually claim that, this is the time of reparation. We live in the time of reparation. And I would say, I pretty agree with that. I would also say that post-colonial reparations, so those specific claims for reparation that are raised by post-colonial citizenship in Europe are actually that start to make sense in the public sphere and are also making common sense in progressive or radical social movements. So they get quite a lot of support among youth. However, even among those who share advocacy for reparation, there's no consensus at all about how reparations should be implemented. So what is to be repaired, who is to be repaired, who is indeed supposed to repair, and how, of course, how to implement reparations. Those are huge sources of disagreement, of course. I cannot resume the whole debate, but of course I will be happy to discuss it later. I will just briefly sketch what are my views, how I try to navigate these debates. So the debate on the implementation of reparation, as I said, is a Pandora box, and difficulties at stake when imagining a fair system of reparative intervention often operate as counter arguments against reparation. Basically, it's so difficult to find a fair way to envision a fair implementation of reparation. If this is so difficult, if it's impossible to establish fair criteria of reparation, then probably reparation shouldn't be implemented. This is not the right way to go. But I would say that these objections about the feasibility of reparation, of the possibility of implementing fair reparative programs, do not undermine the claim that reparation are morally justified, which relies on a very, intuitively moral principle of justice, the idea that wrongs of the past needs to be repaired. So objections that are raised by those who claim that reparation may produce political disadvantages, among which the potential reproduction of injustices and inequalities, those political objections do not undermine the moral claims for reparation. Of course, they raise interesting and very good problems that advocates for reparations should be able to respond to, but I do believe that those political objections belong to a different terrain. It's not about the moral ground for reparation. It's really about what could be the consequences. So basically, the idea is that reparation would paradoxically do justice by reproducing injustices. There are a few classical articles that really clearly state that, I was mentioning in the paper just the Horowitz 10 reasons why reparations for slavery is a bad idea for Blacks and racists too. In terms of political disadvantages, most detractors of reparation argue that reparations are divisive rather than reconciliatory. So they divide more than they reconcile. And reparation programs, this would be the second objection, have really hard time providing, as I was saying earlier, fair criteria for targeting only the class of the injured and repairing them as individuals or as groups. So if the goal is to repair current persisting inequalities, a distributive justice approach centered simply on economic and social equality would do better than reparation. Why do we need reparation? If the problem is to produce a better society, well, resources and access is better distributed, let's just simply go for distributive justice. We do not need to mobilize reparation. We do not need to mobilize history. We do not need to rely on the moral grounds according to which the wrongs of the past needs to be repaired. We don't need all that. Those are, I would say, the most relevant objections to the necessity of reparation, basically objections that focus on the political disadvantages that reparation would produce. And I will respond to the second objection, why do we need reparation? Why don't we just go for distributive justice? Or why don't we simply go for global justice? Because of course, something that I didn't mention, because it's really not the focus of my research, is that there's a huge debate on reparation in terms of interstate reparation. So when it comes to colonial reparation, it's really about interstate bilateral programs of reparation that can be framed also as development or aid programs, or not at all as such, depending, again, those are the main trend. There's the debate on interstate reparation. But just to say that, so one could say, let's go for distributive justice, or let's go for global justice in order to repair the relationship between former colonizer and former colonized. And I would try to say in the concluding part of my paper why I do believe that still mobilizing reparation, mobilizing history is relevant, and it adds something to the argument for reparation. But for the first point, so basically the fact that reparation are divisive rather than reconciliatory, I would say so that not only reparation are morally justified, but also politically needed, and they are not divisive insofar as they actually aim at repairing the social contract. So they aim at providing recognition to the victims of injustices via the acknowledgement of the legitimacy of their claims. So this reparative function actually is not meant to divide, it's meant to produce more cohesion. So it's cohesive and reconciliatory to some extent. But also, if the legitimacy of the moral grounds for reparation is clear and accepted, then reparations, politically implemented, shouldn't come across as politically divisive, rather as deeply inclusive. So if the moral principle for reparation is accepted, then reparation are actually to be seen as inclusive insofar as they presuppose a shared social responsibility with regards to the task of repairing the wrongs of the past and their persisting consequences. Additionally, reparations are meant to respond to systemic and structural injustice, such as genocide or epistemicide of language and culture, mass inferiorization and dehumanization of millions of human beings. And those systemic and structural injustice cannot be reduced to the sum of individual injustices, so cannot be repaired individually. And I believe that if we do adopt a non-individual and non-individualistic approach, this would also reduce the divisive impact of reparation. Basically, if the problem comes from understanding reparation according to criteria of biological descendants, this could have indeed a divisive impact on society. But if we look at reparation from a different perspective, so thinking that reparation should be implemented collectively because they are meant to repair structural injustice and collective mass injustice that cannot just be reduced to the sum of individual injustice, then we will avoid the danger of the consequences, the divisive consequences that would come from an individual approach to reparation. Sorry. And I would add to that that another problem comes from, let's say, the many kind of injustice that reparation are meant to repair. For sure, cultural injustice, spatial injustice, segregation, political injustice as misrepresentation or underrepresentation, epistemic injustice as misrecognition. All this kind of injustice can be clearly, I think it's easy to understand why and how this kind of injustice can be redressed collectively by public programs or public intervention of different kinds in the field of education, culture, public space, etc. When it comes to economic injustice or social injustice, so when it comes to the economic and social effect of long-lasting historical injustices, so poverty or impaired access to social mobility, to education, to healthcare, to housing, to justice, it's more complicated and more controversial, the task of understanding how reparation can be provided as collective reparation. And the further question is to understand to what extent the task of repairing this kind of injustice, so economic and social injustice, can be carried on through the implementation of collective programs, or wouldn't in that specific case be better to think of individual reparations that would be more appropriate, so to avoid to repair prosperous and socially successful members of the class of the injured. So, for example, the very banal example that I took in the paper is, for example, would Bill Cosby be entitled to reparations because he's a person of African descent living in the US? So to what extent we could think that Bill Cosby could be entitled to get reparation funds? So the issue undoubtedly represents a problem that needs to be carefully addressed by reparation advocates, because it points to potentially unjust consequences of reparative justice. And in this respect, I would say that reparations need to be, of course, conceived and implemented intersectionally as much as inequalities need to be read intersectionally. And I'm using the notion of intersectionality, which is a concept meant to bring together different kind of oppression, to read them together, indeed, as interlocking. I'm actually using intersectionality in that sense, but also in the opposite sense, as a sort of litmus test to understanding to what extent different layers of oppression intersect and to what extent they do not intersect. So, for example, to continue with the example of Bill Cosby, for sure, we could think that reparation programs that are aimed at destigmatizing culturally and epistemically all people of African descent, so programs that are aimed with different means, aimed at repairing cultural injustice and epistemic injustice, of course, will include, or Bill Cosby will benefit of those programs. But Bill Cosby will not benefit of any financial or material reparation for economic injustices. And again, I do believe that those programs for economic injustice still need to be thought in terms of collective programs rather than lump sum payments to be individually attributed to those who can prove their direct descendants from victims of colonial crimes or slavery. So in my view, state-administered social programs for reparation should provide what is needed to repair intersectional inequalities affecting the victims of historical wrongs. And economic inequalities that do not concern such victims should also be addressed, of course, by the state, although not through the prism through frameworks of reparation. And in that sense, once again, a theory of postcolonial justice is not exhaustive, it's very limited. It focuses on the reparation of historical crimes and enduring injustices, but this doesn't mean that the fight against economic injustice and economic inequalities per se is less politically or morally relevant than the reparation of historical injustices. And so one should not be pursued at the expense of the other. There's no competition. Both interventions are needed. It's just that the fight against economic inequalities that are not related to past crimes or historical crimes doesn't need to be pursued through the prism of reparation. Just to conclude very briefly about post-colonial justice as critical and reparative. Since I've really spent a lot of time in presenting the paper, I'll just use the sort of very final sentence that I prepared to express the circularity of my argument. So I'm arguing that a theory of postcolonial justice is critical insofar as it is reparative, and it is reparative insofar as it is critical. It is critical since by aiming at repairing history, theory of postcolonial justice produce a critique of the status quo. So by being reparative, by addressing the need to repair the past, it produced a critique of the status quo. But it's equally reparative insofar as by exposing, acknowledging, and criticizing the wrongs of the past, it contributes to repair the social contract. So there is something which is intrinsically reparative in the very critical function that a theory of postcolonial justice exerts. By raising claims for repairing historical wrong, such as slavery and colonialism, the theory of postcolonial justice elaborates a critique of the past and a critique of the present. So in that sense, by mobilizing reparation, we obtain, so to say, or we produce a critique of the past and of the present. But at the same time, by criticizing the past, by recognizing the past crimes, qua crimes, so qua injustices, by the simple gesture of criticizing the past and criticizing the wrongs of the past, a theory of postcolonial justice has a reparative effect. So just to go back very briefly to the argument of those who believe that we do not need reparation, we just need theory of distributive justice or global justice, and we would get to the same point. I mean, we would get the same goal. I think this is not true. Mobilizing reparation adds something. By mobilizing history, we get a stronger understanding. I mean, not just a stronger, but we really see to what extent the causes of present injustice are past injustices. And sorry, the causes of present inequalities are past injustices, which help us saying to what extent current inequalities are not simply inequalities. Those inequalities are injustices. This, of course, can be done from the prism of distributive justice. I mean, we can read inequalities per se as injustice. But what a theory of reparation brings in through the mobilization of history, on the one hand, is a sort of additional motivational support to the argument of distributive justice. So there is a need to remedy to the wrongs of the past. And so this would be like the sort of moral supplement that a theory of postcolonial justice focused on reparation brings in. The other thing is that I guess that, to put it very simply, something doesn't get repaired if we do not speak of reparation. We need to speak of reparation because by simply speaking of reparation, we're repairing something. Of course, I mean, a lot of theory of reparation it's not just about symbolic reparation. There's a lot of, there is a primarily material functions of reparation that is attributed to reparation in current debate, political debate, but also in current scholarship. Like I do believe that reparation must be also material reparation, but there's something that really happens in terms of reparative effect through the very mobilization of history, the acknowledgement of the wrong of the past as crimes. And if this doesn't happen, there is something that doesn't get repaired. So economic program, cultural program, social program for repairing different sort of injustice of existing injustices wouldn't have the same impact, the same effect if they're not framed as reparation. By mentioning the need to repair the past, we repair. So there's some sort of performative dimension of reparation, that by naming them, something already gets repaired in that process. I'll leave it here. I mean, I have more, and I had this conclusion that I kind of like, but it's just 2 lines, so maybe I'll add it. I was saying that postcolonial justice will not eliminate the long shadow cast on the postcolonial present by the history of colonial slavery. So I do believe that reparation in many ways do not repair. This is the paradox of the whole research I'm conducting, in the sense that I do believe that reparation are needed and they're necessary, but they're clearly insufficient. This will not be the end of everything. I mean, it will not be the end of the fight against racism, for sure, let alone the fight against capitalism. But there is something that happened with reparation. There is a movement of shedding light on the past. A theory of postcolonial justice, truly shedding light on the past, may be the beginning of an authentic postcolonial enlightenment. That's the end that I'm self-celebrating, precisely because I put together those 2 terms in a sort of, I mean, for many, I guess that for partisan of enlightenment, speaking of a postcolonial enlightenment would be a sort of oxymoron, and on the other hand, for many postcolonial scholars, speaking of a postcolonial enlightenment also would be a problem. But I do believe that there's something of the kind, some sort of postcolonial enlightenment that can happen by shedding light to the past, on the past. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Very rich, very interesting, stimulating presentation. The first question will be by Steve, because unfortunately he will have to leave a little early, so he gets to speak first today.
I'm sorry about
An
that.
exception to the rule.
Yes, exactly.
Otherwise, he's always the last to ask the question.
Exactly.
Not today.
Exactly. Julian keeps me in line. But thank you very much. And in so many ways, I guess this goes without saying, but it needs to be said anyway. This is just such an important project, and I can't sort of state enough how important I think it is to work through these issues. So thank you for that. I do want to come back just very quickly to this problem you raised about what you referred to as a political problem as opposed to a moral problem, which you presented largely, as I understood it, the political problem was a question of feasibility. That is, or at least that was how I understood you saying that, that when it's political, it's partially who and to whom and how will we actually achieve these reparations. And your point, with which I entirely agree, is that we cannot leave the fact that very difficult problem, that problem is so difficult to solve, cannot prevent us from recognizing the moral imperative of the injustice that was already done. But it seems to me that there is that is an important part, or at least as I'm hearing you, this is actually an important part of coming up with what could look like a post-colonial theory of justice. Because it seems to me that it's related to what I think I heard when you were speaking. Sometimes you use the term injustice, and sometimes you use the word crime. And it seems to me that those two elements of what require and demand morally reparations actually have two different functions, have fundamentally different functions in the actual reparations process. A crime has a relationship to history in which you might have to understand the motives, you might need to understand how we got there, but we have the facts. We know that such and such a thing happened. With slavery, we have a general sense of the number of thousands and thousands of people who were killed in this process. We have cases of genocide, etc. So that's a crime. And its relationship to history is relatively discrete. Then we have injustice. Mm-hmm. Its relationship to history is much more complex in terms of interpretation and in terms of its structural place, at once in terms of how it happened, what its impact was, and what its legacy is. And it seems to me that in terms of reparations against crimes is one thing, and we have all kinds of cases of reparations, especially regarding the Holocaust and Nazi Germany, but we have others of reparations for crimes and war crimes. But reparations for structural injustice, it seems to me that that's where the situation becomes particularly complicated. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that it's a question of trying to parse out for a post-colonial theory of justice, crime versus injustice, and event in one sense versus structure, and therefore how reparations could function at once as you said, a somewhat perhaps unsatisfying one-time reparation or something like that, which might actually work for a crime, but certainly couldn't work for structural injustice, right? So I'm wondering if that's a distinction that means something to you, and if you have any thoughts on that more generally.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So basically, I mean, one thing I was mentioning about the sort of political consequences that would not undermine the moral argument, that was related to the sort of disadvantages that one can think could come, like the sort of social and political consequences, how much society would be even more divided rather than reconciled by reparation. Those are the political consequences. But just then to go back to what I think is the core of your question, basically, do I conflate notion of injustice and crime? And you clearly point out that crimes are facts, events that can be proved by fact-finding. Truth can be told about crimes and injustice, especially, I mean, I was speaking of structural and systemic injustice, in order not to individualize the crime, so to say, right? So in many ways, if we do not speak of systemic or structural injustices, we then end up talking of the individual crimes that actually pertain to individuals, and then we should opt for a sort of, descendant model, or and that would lead us to having a much more individualistic approach to the issue. So your question basically is, how, to what extent can crime and injustice be taught together? Or maybe you're also suggesting that crimes cannot be, or rather, crimes can be thought as injustice. I think it would be okay for you to say that a crime is an injustice. But then if I'm talking about injustices, how does injustice can be reduced to crimes? And then how can we think through the same model according to which we think of reparation for crime of those injustices? So, I mean, the idea that crime is an injustice is fine for you. When I'm talking about slavery and colonialism as crimes and injustices, I'm actually presupposing that there are crimes, so there are facts that can be traced and proved. And I guess that, again, as you mentioned the Holocaust, which is actually a paradigmatic examples of how reparation programs have been taught, interestingly enough, overcoming the common legal obstacles that are usually mobilized against reparation. So, for example, one of the arguments against slavery reparation is slavery was not illegal when it was practiced. So how can we retroactively consider unjust something that was not, or how can we consider illegal retrospectively something that was not illegal at that time? There's also a big debate whether that was legal or not, whether slavery was really legal or not, and for whom it was legal, of course. But we can have a similar argument. How about the Holocaust, in the sense that, although it sounds really horrible to say so, well, it was, what happened was not illegal for the Reich. So in many ways, the fact of considering something as a crime against humanity, this allowed to overcome the legality of the condition under which the crime or a certain action, to be neutral, has been perpetrated. So of course it becomes a crime, not because the law of the time it's different from today's law, but precisely because those crimes against humanity have a sort of transhistorical value. So there are crimes independently from when they have been perpetrated. And I guess that a similar argument can be done about slavery and about colonial crimes. So indeed, I'm talking about crimes. I'm talking about crimes that, as much as other crimes that are like genocides that today's transitional justice look at as crimes, where there are victims and perpetrators. So I do believe that when we speak of slavery and colonialism and genocide of indigenous people, we're talking about crimes. Those crimes are injustices. So the same as you would say that the Holocaust is a crime and that crime is an injustice. So it's the same process, I would say. But then I do, let's say, I do rely more on the notion of structural and systemic injustice, precisely because I do believe that the best approach one can have to reparation, also for its political consequences, but also for a better understanding of this kind of crime, is that those crimes were not individuals, were indeed massive and structural, and they were not simply related to, let's say, the crime of killing people, robbing people, violating people, abusing people. But of course, when one speaks of structural and systemic injustice, is probably adding to the crime something which is less material, less traceable, which is, for example, when we talk about the historical trauma, stigmatization, like the stigma that goes beyond discrimination. It's something that exists at a cultural level, at the symbolic level, at the psychic level of collective entities. So those are, for me, still part of the crime, or consequences of the crime. Let's say if the crime was slavery, like depriving people of freedom, selling them as object, and abusing their bodies, those are factual crimes. But indeed, one can say that those factual crimes produce as well other aspect that may not be described as crimes, like the stigma or the dehumanization, the sort of psychic trauma may not be considered as crimes per se, but are part of this larger conception of injustice. This cannot be quantified, but I have no problem in thinking that there are crimes that, I mean, there are injustice related to crimes that may not be quantified. A body which is raped, that's a crime. But the injustice that that body or that person suffered, it's something that may encompass more unmaterial dimension, so to say, that cannot be easily quantified. And this is the same with every crime. Like a crime is a crime per se, the facts, the numbers, and then there's a sort of aura that it creates as a consequence, and that count as an injustice. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's very, it's really a question of trying to just dig deeper and think about how these two would articulate in terms of reparations, and if they would require the same kinds of reparations, or if a post-colonial theory of justice would need to think about the two separately. But unfortunately, I need to...
Oh, sorry, I was keeping you to listen. Okay, good. Just go. So,
thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye, thank you. Thank you for your question.
All right. Of those who are participating online, if you have a question, you can just turn on your mic and speak, or ideally also your camera and speak, or you can also raise your hand using the virtual button if you have a question. I also have a question, but if
I do as well.
One of you has one first, but now Kendra has also a hand. So Kendra is next, and then whoever else wants to speak, please indicate that. Otherwise, it's going to be me.
There's a question in the chat, but I don't know if you want to go first, you in the room, or if I'll take this first. So, hi, Professor Mascat, I have a question I really hope will be coherent to it. Okay, with my scope limited to the slavery reparation debate in the US, I wonder how you think this process would occur in the current legal system. If the distribution of resources would have to come from the government, how would this come to pass within the system of nationwide democratic involvement? Would a post-colonial theory of justice rather emphasize the autonomy of the members of the injured group in the implementation of reparation? If yes, can slavery reparation even be implemented under the typical legislative process of the US? I'm not sure I fully understood the question. So the question, and I don't know if the person can...
Mallory is here, so Mallory, if you want to elaborate, but...
So the question is how reparation can take shape or be implemented in the current legal US system. I mean, as I'm sure you know, that there's a... Sorry, I can't put my microphone. Okay, try to I guess that the question is how reparation can be implemented in the current legal system in the US, and then more specifically, if the distribution of the resources have to come from the government, how would this come to pass within the system of nationwide democratic involvement? So the problem that you see here is how, if this redistribution of resources that reparation would entail has to come from the state, how this would come to pass within the system of nationwide democratic involvement. This I'm not sure to understand exactly what you mean. And also when you ask whether a theory of post-colonial justice would emphasize the autonomy of the members of the injured group, I'm not sure if you're referring here to the fact that indeed in the US, there's a very polarized discussion about whether reparation would actually repair if they are to be implemented individually. And of course, those who support such an approach would say that group reparation wouldn't repair the victims. There's a similar debate for what concerns reparation of colonial crimes, where also some empirical study have been done. I'm thinking about a specific study of a Dutch scholars about reparation between the Dutch state and Indonesian women, the so-called Rawajeda case, where widows have been repaired for the loss of a colonial massacre. And the study that the scholar is conducting on the victims that have finally been repaired by a lump sum payment of 20,000 euros. To what extent this reparation was actually politically detrimental to the community for a lot of things that happened after. So it's not really about whether repairing the loss, repairing a colonial massacres by paying 20,000 times 11 is something that make any sense morally or politically, but it was rather a critique of the way in which individual reparation of lump sum payments affect the reparative process. What happened when some get repaired, some others don't get repaired, on which basis? So this indeed was a research focusing on the divisive impact of reparation. So I'm wondering whether your question on emphasizing, yes, that's it, do collective reparation have to come from the government resources? Yeah, indeed, maybe I wasn't enough explicit in the paper, but I do believe that reparation programs should be welfare programs, collective programs, targeting, as I was saying, specific groups that are in need of reparation. So, and it comes to, I guess, to the sort of same problem, or at least to the same need of blurring boundaries. Because if you think about repairing post-colonial citizens in Europe, would you repair wealthy, successful, let's say, French citizen of Algerian descent, or Italian citizen of Somali descent, without any other, specifications, or would you provide collective program that indeed, without having an individualistic approach, would still target those who are, according to different criteria, in need for reparation? So basically, we go back to the Bill Cosby example. And again, as I was saying, if you think of the implementation of sort of, systematic, much bigger affirmative actions or welfare program of support in access to housing, healthcare, education for not simply those who can prove to be descendant of former slaves, but those who are belong to the people of African descent and may need this kind of support. So if you combine, let's say, the reparation of slavery as the crimes to the actual need, some people of African descent may not need economic reparation, may not need social support, but still what you would produce by addressing the problem collectively would be something that may have a much bigger impact that only allowing those who can prove a much bigger impact in terms of repairing inequalities and repairing justice, that only addressing those who can actually prove to be descendant of victims of slavery or colonial crimes, and those who can prove the trauma and the consequences of their status of heirs of the victimhood. So these are really believe that may have very detrimental political consequences. This sort of raise for the possibility of proving a clear lineage of descendants for being repaired. I guess that collective programs of systematic, support to all the different fields that I mentioned earlier would be a much better way to approach reparation of injustices, looking again at those among the group of the victims or the class of injured may need specific reparation. So it's enough, for example, let's say Bill Cosby wouldn't access reparation because of income criteria that needs to be defined for those who may apply, not for reparation funds. This is not what I'm talking about, because of course, like lump sum payments or reparation fund that can be accessed only by certain individuals who can prove to be descendant of former slaves, this would be the same sort of, methodologically wrong approach or individualistic approach. I simply believe that if the community, and a community that doesn't need to be defined by the sum of the individuals, but as the category of those Afro-descendant who may be in need to be repaired. You don't need to prove case by case the relation of causes and effect, like to what extent slavery has affected that person. You just need to prove to what extent slavery may have affected a large community of individuals who clearly, the racial wealth gap is something that doesn't need to be proved because it's already been studied. So this is enough for saying why certain communities need to be repaired. There's still a problem to that. I'll conclude with this note. Of course, you may say, but this, for example, wouldn't repair different communities that are not, descendant of slaves. Or just to provide objections to my own argument, to what extent you would say that interstate reparation, that a country like Portugal should repair a huge former empire, while a country like the US would have to repair indigenous people, but not directly for crimes committed by the US as a state that didn't exist at the time. So to what extent the US, for example, wouldn't play any role at an international level in terms of reparation, because any colonial crimes can be easily ascribed to the US or Canada. There are other crimes that can be ascribed to them, but then the question coming of defining to what extent the actual state has liability for crimes that have been committed when the state didn't exist as such. So there are, I'm not saying that providing collective program for reparations is the solution that it's the last word about the whole problem, political problems that are raised through the debate. I just believe that, that there's no way to find positive aspect of the implementation of individualistic approach to reparation. The only positive aspect usually is that there is a real reparation where the individual gets repaired, because there's no such a thing as a collective trauma or a collective injustice. And so there can be collective reparation, but I guess that there's no proof of the fact that the reparation can only be individual and the collectivity cannot be repaired, precisely because there are a lot of different political interventions that repair collectivities or communities or groups rather than individual existing program of reparation. And they do have reparative functions. The merit of collective reparation of an individual comes through very strongly. I agree with what was okay.
I think we should move on here to the next question. Thank you. Kendra is next.
Yes. Thank you so much. This was so interesting. So just to give a little context to my question, I took a course on transitional justice and political reconciliation, and the course convener was incredibly skeptical, so that does inform my knowledge of the subject. And also it was 2 years ago, so I don't have a citation right at the top of my head to sort of back up my query. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the perspective tension between your very lucid conception of what post-colonial means with the filial sort of association to colonization, and that it is not seeking to turn a page, and the fact that a lot of transitional justice projects and a lot of political reconciliation and reparative projects tend to take that stance, even if not in their intention, but in fact in practice, that there is sort of a confining tendency within reparative projects to put an end then to the harm that has occurred and say this has now reached a point where it is now being repaired and has that sort of experience. So do you see that there's a contradiction in there? Do you have any thoughts on that? Or
contradiction in the approach of transitional justice, of turning the page and reestablishing new criteria, new principle, a new story, a new face for the country. I mean, it's hard for me to say, yeah, indeed, I would find very hard, historically, political, existentially, the idea that things can, page can be turned. But I guess that you already mentioned in your question the answer. I emphasize to what extent the postcolonial is a point of no return. Spivak has another beautiful quote about, the relationship that the post-colonial may have with the legacy of modernity, which is of course also an abusive legacy in many ways, because cannot be disconnected by the history of colonialism. And she mentioned that, for example, our relationship to Hegel or to Kant or to the legacy of modernity cannot be resumed to the option of either accusing or excusing, right? And she has said rather that abusing that legacy, so producing different uses like sabotaging that legacy would be the best way to engage with it. That's also where my idea of post-colonial enlightenment comes from. Yeah, so to say that in many ways, if the post-colonial is a point of no return, if the post-colonial is the child of a rape, if post-colonial has a child of a rape, cannot repudiate where, that from which it comes from, there is something which is a sort of intrinsical yoke that cannot be or a double bind that cannot be dissolved. So it's not possible to fully repair the post-colonial. The post-colonial would be constantly violated. So the violation is there. It is originated from a violation. In that sense, there's no possibility. And I guess that not all post-colonial scholars would agree, but for me, the best post-colonial scholars do have this very tragic sense of the fact that what has been done cannot be undone. So reparation is possible in the very limited sense of producing remedy to something that happened, but that has no capacity to remove or to eliminate what happened. Again, basically, what has been done cannot be undone. And I guess the post-colonial, the sort of quintessential dimension of the post-colonial is precisely to recognize this irreparability which is at stake. So theory of postcolonial justice cannot easily say that by repairing we enter a new world. As I was very modestly saying, it just matter of reestablishing the social contract on grounds that are slightly fairer than they are right now. So transitional justice is too much optimistic for me, and also in terms of
Also, just really. Sorry, just to follow that up, I completely agree. I think that's very helpful. I think the point I was trying to make about transitional justice and reconciliation and repair is the way that it sort of entrenches the authority of the entity that is making the reparation. I think that that's just sort of a question that I have that I've seen. Like I said, I'm so sorry I forget the citation, but it was particularly about South Africa. And that is a particular manifestation of truth and reconciliation. So it can't be extrapolated and applied broadly, but that there was a very, again, like legitimating effect for the entity that was sort of compelling that process of reparation, as opposed, and it didn't fall out equally for the people who were supposed to be receiving the reparation and the people who were supposed to be performing the reparation, that there was still within the process a significant benefit that was gained by the people who were performing reparation to the detriment of the people who were supposedly on the receiving end. So
yeah, and I guess this is indeed, again, another good answer to what extent this reconciliation doesn't necessarily work as turning the page and starting anew on sort of egalitarian basis. Even the reparation process produce again, sort of inequalities, as you were saying about the South African case. And yeah, maybe I can, there's an interesting article that, where is it? Well, I'll post maybe the title of this chapter from a book on reparation. The title of the book is Reparation and Interdisciplinary Inquiries. There's an interesting chapters about the process of reparation, I mean, the reconciliation in post-apartheid South Africa. And I guess that a lot of limits of the whole process of the kind that you mentioned are also referred there. And I think it's a very good article. So I'll just, or I can email you the reference to this article, maybe.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, if there's no one else who would like to jump in, I will take the liberty of asking a question to Jamila. So thanks very much once again for this talk. I have 2 points that I would like to raise. One concerns the focus on the past and looking backwards, as you say. And I was wondering to what extent that's an accurate description then of post-colonial justice and also of the types of worries you have in mind, given that when you refer to the contemporary movements of decolonization, decolonizing the university, the museum, the public space, etc., it's not clear to me that all of these movements really have only a concern for past injustices in mind. It's also, I think, very much about contemporary concerns of how certain people with certain backgrounds, to put it very abstractly, are treated in contemporary societies, and what the effects are of having certain readings on the syllabus, not other readings on the syllabus. That's about people here now today. It's not just about what has happened in the past and redressing past injustices. And so I think that a lot of what many people think post-colonial justice would do, to the extent that it is a response and a reconstruction of the demands that are actually occurring in the public space, it would have more of this contemporary aspect to it as well. And of course, you address Lou and how Lou takes up Young's structural approach to injustice to think through the wrongs of colonial injustice, and she very much has this contemporary account of colonial injustice where it has produced certain structures that now affect our positioning within the global order, and that's very much a contemporary concern too. And finally, one definition of post-colonial studies that I usually use is by Ina Kerner. She's a professor at Gießen University, and she's written an introduction to post-colonial studies in German. And she usually defines it saying that post-colonial studies studies the effects of colonialism, informally colonizing as well as informally colonized societies. So this definition focuses on the effects that colonization has on contemporary societies. And if we start like from this understanding of post-colonial studies, it would also transcend the perspective towards past and just injustices, and would also integrate more contemporary concerns. So that would be the first point about the relevance of the contemporary problems for a conception of post-colonial justice.
Can I just respond to that, Julian, first?
Sure.
Because of course, I agree with you. So the first thing is that I do believe that the colonial claims, generally speaking, I mean, all the sort of that you mentioned, the colonized university, the museum, the city, etc., the status toppled down, the curricula that needs to be rewritten, the restitution process that should be maintained by museums in Europe. All those claims are, of course, pretty much related to the present and to the future, one can say. I do see the reparative demand, which is implicit in there, because there is a demand of reparation of a sort of cultural and epistemic injustice, which is there, like the fact that there has been a constant deprivation of recognition, a constant evaluation of the way certain communities and groups exist in our post-colonial European society. So there is a reparative content in these demands. Then your point would be, but then, I mean, the demands you were talking about are not necessarily just backward looking. So how can you say that a post-colonial theory of justice is repairing only the past if many of the demands that you're collecting or that you're including in your theory of post-colonial justice actually are talk about the present? Are talking about the present, I would say, once again, by mobilizing the past. So the present needs to be repaired precisely of what has happened. And of course, the future also need to be changed. So I do think that a theory of post-colonial justice, it's backward looking in the sense that look pretty much at the extent to which what happened in the past, precisely the crimes of the past, can be understood as injustice, and then what injustice they need to be repaired. This is the move. So post-colonial justice look at the past, need this narrative about history, about what happened in history, need to clearly say what have been considered for a long time fact or event, talk about les faits d'Algérie. Those facts and events are actually crimes, and as such need to be accounted for. These, I guess, it's also a huge task for a theory of post-colonial justice. This whole sort of historical reconstruction that really names things that happen as crimes and as injustice. In that sense, this is backward looking. I also mentioned that a theory of post-colonial justice is backward looking, but of course is also looking at the present and looking at the future, because reparation may repair society as it is, and they create condition for different sort of sharing or different form of social contract, as I said, for the future. So there is a future-oriented dimension. But the reason why I define post-colonial justice as something that is mostly concerned with the past and with the reparation of the past is that then, I mean, if you take it from the other way around, so how can you think that post-colonial justice may repair anything in the present if a post-colonial justice is concerned with with the consequences of colonialism as it exists today? So how can a theory of post-colonial justice do not encompass the need of saying something about imperialism or current neo-colonial relations that still exist? To what extent a post-colonial justice can engage with those processes? Those are concerns for a theory of global justice, I would say, that of course need to be addressed, and they're not in competition. But if I see the quintessential specificity of the post-colonial, which is pretty much related to the way we relate to the legacy of the past. This is when maybe my reading or my way of doing post-colonial scholarship, I mean, post-colonial critique is precisely this sort of working through the legacy of the past, constantly reinterrogating the legacy of the past, not just the historical legacy, so the facts that are actually crimes, but also the legacy, the cultural legacy of modernity, and how a post-colonial critique can engage with that. So in that sense, there is a sort of constantly backward looking of the post-colonial, which doesn't prevent the post-colonial from engaging with the present or for changing things in the present or for claiming things in the present. Of course, I mean, claims for slavery reparation, as much as claiming for decolonizing the city, do not claim reparation to be done by the past. That would be insane. So reparations can only be made in the present and can only have consequences in the future. What I'm saying is that in order to claim for reparation, post-colonial justice look at the past and ask for repairing the past in its consequences. I mean, in the persisting consequences. Decolonizing the city speaks of how we deal with the legacy of colonialism. What do we do with all these studies that are, that are there to honor murderers, genocider, brutal military enterprises that happen? So it's really about how do we deal with this legacy. It's about how we deal with the past. And I would say that even when it comes to decolonizing the university, it's precisely to deal with how the canon has been constructed, why we do call philosophy, I mean, Western philosophy. Where does it come from? And once again, in order to understand why it is so, one needs to look at the past, at the very history of the constitution of disciplines. I guess that Edward Said would be a major contribution in order to understand how the canonization of different disciplines of the humanities has been historically constructed. And from looking at the history, we would see to what extent colonial history plays a very important role in the very way in which our curricula or the discipline established their canon and their curricula. So I still believe that there's a lot of mobilization of the past that is needed in order to make demands for the present and for the future. Clearly, the claim for reparation are for the hic et nunc and for the future, not from the past.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. So my second point, and I will just put a proposal on the table, and then you may or may not address it, given that we're running a little bit over time already. But the way I understand your conceptual bookkeeping, so to speak, is that there is a theory, anti-capitalist critical theory of global justice, and then you have different subchapters. You have the distributive justice subchapter, and you have the post-colonial justice subchapter, and then you have to think about how they interact with each other so that you have a global theory of egalitarian anti-capitalist justice, of which post-colonial justice and distributive justice are important chapters. And my suggestion would be just to think about the possibility of having a theory of post-colonial justice, of which claims of distributive justice and say claims of reparative justice or of historical justice would be different subchapters. So you could blow up your post-colonial theory and say our present is fundamentally marked by colonialism that defines our contemporary social relationships, and then whatever we argue for in terms of distributive justice and whatever we argue for in terms of reparative justice and historical justice has to be thought through this historical condition in which we find ourselves in the present. And partly what is animating this idea is that I find it difficult to cancel out, to differentiate between distributive justice claims and reparative justice claims or post-colonial claims in the way you sometimes suggest, because I think they're often so intricately related to one another that it's difficult to make this difference. And then secondly, you have this literature on historical justice by authors like Daniel Butt, Rectifying Historical Injustice, Jeff Spinner-Halef on Enduring Injustice, that have already established this realm of historical injustice, especially in the international realm. And it's not quite clear what post-colonial justice, as you understand it, would be adding to this debate, and why we would need a different term from the term that they have already been using all along. And so perhaps there's a different way of doing the conceptual bookkeeping that may be valuable as well. But that's a comment from someone who has thought about it this afternoon, and you've been working on it for longer. So I'm sure there's some hole in this proposition, but just want to put it out there.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. So basically, on the one hand, you're suggesting, why don't you make your theory of postcolonial justice global, rather than arguing that there is a global theory of justice, which is an anti-capitalist theory of justice. And you see, I mean, when I say subchapter, it's just an easy way to visualize what it means, in the sense that postcolonial justice has a limited scope, as I was saying. And of course, it's not just an appendix of a theory of global justice. I do believe that there cannot be global justice without rethinking the past and without embarking on the process of producing a post-colonial critique and a theory of postcolonial justice. But at the same time, I do believe that the sort of all-encompassing or overarching framework should be established by the global a theory of global justice, quanti-capitalist justice. That's the sort of Marxist, if you want, underlying of, that was also the starting point for me for addressing this issue. And to that extent, I do believe that postcolonial justice brings something to a global theory of justice, which is essential to it. This cannot be a theory of global justice without an understanding of what postcolonial justice is. But at the same time, is postcolonial justice the best candidate, theoretically speaking, for understanding capitalist injustices, for example? So would be the post-colonial framework the framework that would allow me not only to understand neo-colonial imbalances existing in current geopolitics, but also to understand and to target specifically issue of class injustice that happens independently, I would say, if you understand what I mean. I mean, nothing can be totally considered independent in our current world, but how would you target, from the perspective of a theory of postcolonial justice, class injustices that happen here and now, or in any context? Or how would you, from a theory, from the perspective of a theory of postcolonial justice, frame minority right justice for LGBTQ people? So what would be the specific contribution? Of course, there are contributions in terms of queer of color critique that can establish connection, but I would still maintain that there is a need of all-encompassing approach to global justice that sets, so to say, the framework. And what you call the subchapters are, for me, not necessarily subchapters. I know that I call them subchapters, but there are just different foci that exist from within a global theory that cannot but include all these dimensions to be really global and to be really all-encompassing and to be really justice. Cannot be justice without taking into consideration all these dimensions. Indeed, I do believe that if we limited the scope of postcolonial justice, we can really understand to what extent postcolonial justice is reparative. I wouldn't frame global justice as reparative. And I don't even think that Halevin in Enduring Injustice is speaking of the kind of reparative path that I'm trying to reconstruct to postcolonial justice. To the extent your question was, to what extent you think that post-colonial theory of postcolonial justice adds something to argument on distributive justice and other arguments that have been mobilized in the debate of how to deal with historical injustice. There are a lot of sources on the debate, from the debate on historical injustice that I'm using. I think, for example, Jena Thompson. So I think that there's a lot that can be taken from there, but there's also something that can be specifically added from the post-colonial perspective, on the one hand. On the other hand, what the post-colonial add to the distributive model? Well, this is what I said, like, there is no reparation if we do not speak of reparation. There's no reparative function that distributive justice by targeting inequalities can produce in terms of reparation of the wrongs of the past. So of course we could target current inequalities and solve them, and this is fine, and this is good, and this needs to be done, but we do not repair the wrongs of the past. We don't touch them at all. We can simply look at inequalities as they exist, say that these inequalities are injustices and as such need to be fought, but we don't get any reparation for the wrongs of the past. The past never comes into the discourse. So I would again maintain that the specificity of postcolonial justice is bringing in the past. This is also where the whole emphasis on the backward looking comes. Is this remobilization of the past that is crucial to postcolonial justice. So this is what postcolonial justice adds to distributive justice. For distributive justice, you don't need to mobilize history. You don't need to say that what happened in the past was wrong, that those wrongs were mass injustices, and that those justices need to be acknowledged and repaired. There's no acknowledgement of that. So there's no reparative dimension. This is not to say that distributive injustice doesn't do its job, just to say that it doesn't repair what is postcolonial justice is specifically trying to address in order to get it repaired. on the other hand, it just, I mean, so you said that the debate on historical injustice, I find a lot of contribution interesting. I do believe that do not, again, take into consideration the post-colonial dimension of it. I mean, enduring injustice can be of historical injustice can be very different, and there is some specificity of post-colonial injustices for the way they've been shaped through colonial history. So again, the very focus or the sort of addition that a theory of postcolonial justice can bring to the debate is, again, a specific focus on the post-colonial. The post-colonial is also understood precisely through the lens that I was mentioning, that it's not irrelevant. I mean, I think that decolonial scholarship, so what it's called decolonial scholarship per se, is much more into the possibility of retrieving the past, remedying the past in a way that somehow allowed to turn the page. The post-colonial doesn't believe in that, so to say. So the post-colonial approach, as opposed to decolonial scholarship, it's really focused on the impossibility of total irretrievability of the pre-colonial past. There's no way to go back. There's no way to go back to indigenous cosmologies. There's no way to go back to the voice of the subaltern that has been violated through colonial history, precisely because colonialism is this fissure, is this fracture, is this cut that cannot be completely sutured. So reparation is something that always has to do with this original wounds that never get properly repaired, no matter how much reparation claims can be, as I hope, met and indeed reparation implemented.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. I think for some readers, it would be nice to have like perhaps a section separate on, so what is the post-colonial justice approach doing differently than the historical injustice reparative approach?
No, you're right. I did it very briefly with distributive justice and global justice and corrective justice, because those are also usually the sort of demarcations that are needed and that are done in scholarship. So, and there's also a lot of debate about reparations, advocates about what do we do with corrective justice, why we cannot think of reparation in terms of corrective justice, why we cannot simply use distributive justice, or why we should only use distributive justice because we don't need reparation to do justice or to fight inequality. So those were the sort of paradigms that I mentioned are the ones that are mostly mobilized in the debate, and indeed, I mean, the sort of mapping could be expanded to include other paradigms that still can be distinguished from post-colonial justice.
Great, okay.
Thanks for all the feedback and the question.
I assume there are no further questions at this point, so we can call it a day. Thank you very much, Jamila.
Thank you.
Very intense and enriching discussion and presentation as well. I've learned a great deal. It's a super important topic. So just reiterating what Steve already said at the very beginning, and I look forward to see how this further unfolds. And thanks to everyone else for participating, contributing, listening. There's another talk coming up in 3 weeks from now in this series by Annabelle Lever on December 1st, and we'll follow up soon regarding other practicalities of this series and the workshop in spring.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. I hope to see you soon again in person as well. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Let's hope to meet again soon.
Okay.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.